Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. This week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering the case of Abby Hernández, who was held captive in a shipping container for 9 months and lived to tell about it. This is her survival story of how a random stranger and one wrong move on her captor's part impacted her life in more ways than she could count. I chose to do a survival story this week because I felt like I had been covering a lot of child cases or really gruesome cases, and sometimes we all need something to lift our spirits and remind us that sometimes all you need is hope. So, we're all here for one thing and one thing only. Let's get it. 14-year-old Abby Hernández, who everybody just called Abby, got up for school. She got dressed for a typical day of high school on October 9th, 2013. She was ready to tackle an average Wednesday in a pair of new boots that she had gotten, and she was wearing them and breaking them in for the first time. She was wearing a dark-colored striped long-sleeve shirt and black pants that looked pretty similar to black leggings from the pictures and videos that I watched. Like most of us have done and regretted before, Abby was excited about her new boots that morning, but she would soon come to regret her decision to break in a new pair of boots at school, where she wouldn't exactly be able to change out of them if they started hurting her feet. And by lunchtime, her feet were killing her and blisters were starting to form. But she was not going to let this kill her mood because her 15th birthday was only 3 days away and she was super excited about it. Abby and her mom, Zenya, had planned a birthday party for Abby and invited all of their friends and planned quite a few fun teenage things to do. And Abby was exceptionally excited about taking her driver's test to get her permit. She had recently graduated the 8th grade and was adjusting to being a freshman at Kennett High School in North Conway, New Hampshire. She had a boyfriend named Jimmy Campbell, and she was in teenage love. And this Wednesday seemed like any other day. Abby got dressed, went to school, talked with her best friend Miranda, and when school let out, Abby decided to walk home this day. Even though her feet were killing her, she still opted to walk home instead of riding the bus. And something that I wasn't able to find an exact yes or no answer on while I was researching this case is if Abby decided to walk home from school that day because we know her feet were killing her, we know that blisters were starting to form on her ankles, or did she miss the bus and not really have an option but to walk home? And regardless, she ended up walking home. When Abby's sister Sarah got home from school, Abby wasn't home yet, which was kind of a red flag because Abby always made sure to be home before Sarah, or she would at least let her mom and Sarah know if she was going to be a little later than usual. And after Sarah got home, it was a little while later when Abby's mom Zenya got home, and Abby still wasn't home, but Zenya waited. She didn't really panic. She was thinking maybe Abby had went to a friend's house and just forgotten to call or text to say that she was going to be late. Even though this was extremely out of character for Abby, she was 14. Sometimes even the best teenagers do really dumb things. Zenya had started trying to call and text Abby since she had gotten home from work, but Zenya was not getting any response, which again was weird because Abby always called her mom right back if she did miss a call, and she was a teenager, so she always has her cell phone in her hand. It's kind of like an unspoken teenage law. Zenya finally broke down and got in touch with Abby's high school to see if maybe she was still there for some reason or to see if somebody had seen her after school. The school librarian had actually seen Abby leave, and she told Zenya that Abby had been walking towards her home after school and that she was fine the last time that she saw her. Zenya was a nurse, so her next thought was that maybe Abby had been injured on her walk home from school, and Zenya even said that she thought maybe she had been hit by a car and taken to the emergency room, or even crazier, maybe Abby had appendicitis. But once Zenya called all the local hospitals and nobody matched Abby's description, she became more panicked. And by the time 7 p.m. rolled around, Abby's mom, Zenya, did start to become more panicked with every minute that was passing and with every unanswered call and text. And at 7:17 p.m., Zenya broke down and called to report her 14-year-old daughter, Abby, as a missing person. She described her daughter, Abby, as reliable, loving, extremely athletic, and extremely family-oriented. This just wasn't typical teenage behavior for Abby. Maybe for other kids, but not for Abby. Police, of course, went through the proper channels of ruling out Abby as a runaway and ruling out the possibility of a parental abduction. And even though Abby's dad worked out of town a lot, he was still super close with his family, and nobody thought that he was even a viable possible suspect. And aside from that, everybody that knew the family said that they were extremely close-knit and that there were no problems at home that would make Abby want to escape her life, which is oftentimes the case when teenagers choose to run away. So now they have to rule out whether or not Abby would have left willingly on her own. Teenage runaways aren't as uncommon as we all like to think, but when they checked the last known surveillance footage of Abby, it was at 12:29 p.m. and she was walking down the hallway of her high school and out of the back door after school was dismissed. She had only her backpack with her, no extra bags of clothes, no supplies that you could see, and Zenya was able to confirm that none of Abby's clothes were missing from their house, none of Abby's favorite things, nothing sentimental was missing, nothing was missing from their house except for Abby herself. Police and investigators also had to weigh out the fact that Abby had so much to look forward to in the next few weeks. Her birthday party, her driver permit, and she had a boyfriend. So her life seemed pretty good. So why would she choose now to run away, if that's what she had done? Once all the usual suspects were able to be ruled out, police quickly came to the conclusion that this was a stranger abduction, and soon they would be completely sure of it. Police were able to find the last known picture from Abby, and it was actually from earlier on the same day that she went missing. Abby and her best friend Miranda had been taking pictures in science class together, and as a teenager, if Abby had planned to run away, her best friend Miranda would probably be the first and only one to know about it. But Miranda had also been texting Abby after school that day, and she was also getting no response. So now police need to track down Abby's last known cell phone usage, because all they know at this point was that Abby had last been seen walking home from school while her boyfriend Jimmy Campbell was on the bus texting her. Jimmy had sent Abby a really sweet message, and she replied to him with a heart emoji at 2:53 p.m. Abby's cell phone data and ping show that Abby's last known whereabouts, where her cell phone was known to be, had pinged at a tower on the west side of Cranmore Mountain, which was the normal way that Abby would have taken in order to walk home from school. 14 minutes after Abby sent this heart emoji to her boyfriend Jimmy at 3:07 p.m., Abby's cell phone signal disappears completely about a mile from her house. Almost like her phone had been busted, which may be a little foreshadowing on my part. The search for Abby was one of the largest organized searches in the state of New Hampshire. Abby's missing persons flyers listed her at 5 foot 4 inches tall and approximately 118 pounds, with long brown hair and brown eyes. Her birthday was October 12, 1998, and she was born in Manchester, New Hampshire, to Zenya and Reuben Hernandez. Abby grew up in North Conway, New Hampshire, where she had been reported missing from. Abby's mom, Zenya, went to local news stations and media to hold a press conference on the same night that Abby was reported missing. And at this first press conference, naturally, Zenya begged for Abby's safe return and pled with the community to keep their eyes peeled for anything suspicious and to be on the lookout for anyone matching Abby's description. Missing persons posters were scattered all over this small town of New Hampshire, and 2 days after Abby had been reported missing, the FBI showed up with their help. There were extensive grid searches and multiple volunteers out searching the road where Abby was last known to be walking on her way home. And this was also the same road where her cell phone had last pinged. And once the FBI got involved, so did the Attorney General's office, the state police, and basically any other organization that has the authority to help. They were all there going door to door asking for eyewitnesses and looking for clues, tips, or any leads concerning Abby's whereabouts. And Abby's 15th birthday came and went, and there was no elaborate big birthday party like they had all planned. Instead, there was a candlelit vigil held for Abby's family and the public to attend. But where was Abby really? Abby had been walking home from school when a small sedan-type car pulled up and a man asked if she needed a ride. Abby says that when this man stopped and asked if she needed a ride, she even kind of thought to herself in the back of her head like, "Oh, thank God, my feet are killing me." So this makes me think that whatever this man said to her had to have made her feel comfortable enough to get in the car with him, because she's 14 and it's also 2013. She knew better than to get in the car with somebody that she doesn't know, but she got in anyway, so he had to have seemed friendly enough, which is why you don't trust anyone. So Abby gets in the car and they head in the direction of Abby's house. But she's an extremely smart 14-year-old because she asked this man to drop her off at a sandwich shop that is nearby her house so that he wouldn't know where she actually lived. But when the turning lane came and went for him to drop her off at this deli sandwich shop, he kept driving. This man told Abby that he needed to make a stop at the Home Depot store that was nearby before he dropped her off at the sandwich shop so that he wouldn't have to backtrack after he dropped her off. And at the same time that Abby's abductor pulled into the very back of the Home Depot parking lot, is about the same time that Abby got a gut feeling in the pit of her stomach that something was just not right. So once they get into the parking lot of the Home Depot store, Abby tries to tell this man that this is close enough to her house that she could just walk the rest of the way from here. Because at this point, Abby's just trying to get away from him and escape this feeling in her gut. She unbuckled her seatbelt, and this is when he pointed a gun at her thigh. He told her that he will either blow her brains out or slit her throat if she tries to escape. This is when he took the baseball hat off of his own head and put it on Abby's head, trying to conceal her face. He put a jacket over top of her, handcuffed her, and with his bare hands, he completely broke her cell phone in half. He pulled out of the Home Depot parking lot, which is when investigators later assume that her phone went completely offline. Abby's abductor drives off from the Home Depot parking lot, and Abby tries to plead with him, telling him that she doesn't judge him for taking her and that he could just let her go and she wouldn't tell a soul about him. He doesn't really reply to any of her pleas, and when he catches her looking out of the window, she felt something that was tingly and extremely painful on her leg, and at this point she was pretty convinced that he had just shot her. Now, her abductor hadn't exactly shot her, but he had tased her with a stun gun. And this would become a pretty normal occurrence during Abby's time in captivity. Abby remembers driving for what seemed like an eternity, and she started noticing that they were only driving on back roads out of the town of Conway. She started to piece together the fact that this man had purposely taken the back roads just to escape red lights and traffic cameras. Abby doesn't exactly know what else to do, so she just starts singing Amazing Grace. And when her abductor hears her, he asks if she wants to listen to music as he plugs his iPod in to play a Rolling Stones song. Abby's kidnapper had actually driven her more than 30 miles from her home, and Abby wasn't even in North Conway anymore. Now she was in Gorham, New Hampshire. There had been absolutely no social media activity by Abby. She had no money, no cell phone records showing that she was active, and it almost seemed like Abby had just vanished into thin air. After the drive that seemed to never end, the car finally came to a halt, and Abby was then walked from the car that she had just shortly before this accepted a ride from towards a shipping container behind a mobile home that's pretty off by itself and secluded. As she walked from the car towards a makeshift room inside of this shipping container, she noticed her surroundings, and she could see that they were basically in the middle of nowhere with nothing but wooded landscape surrounding them. There were no other houses, no other people, and no one around to see her being walked into this huge cargo container. As Abby steps inside of a soundproof shipping container turned makeshift room, she sees green carpet and immediately notices a yellow flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag, and it's hanging on the wall. She also notices some tools and clutter around. Abby's abductor, who we would later find out is actually Nathaniel Kibby, walked Abby into a small room that he had created inside of this shipping container. He put tape over her eyes, he gags her, and ties a t-shirt over her head. He then shoves a motorcycle helmet over top of the tape and the t-shirt that are already covering her face and eyes, and he then binds her feet together. So now her hands and ankles are both bound, her head is covered by a motorcycle helmet that already has tape and a t-shirt wrapped around it. This gives me Ariel Castro vibes like I've never felt before. After the Nathaniel, who I'm just going to call Nate throughout the rest of this episode, gets her exactly where he wants her, he sexually assaults her for the first of many times. Abby says that when she would start praying to God, she would refuse to say amen when she was done with a prayer because she was afraid that if she said amen at the end of it, that would mean that was the end of her prayers and that God would leave her. Back in Abby's hometown of North Conway, New Hampshire, there are literally hundreds of tips pouring in over the first 4 or 5 days of the search for Abby, but none of those leads seemed to go anywhere. There was no eyewitnesses to give a description of the car or the perpetrator, and as the investigation progressed, they didn't seem to be getting any closer to finding Abby or her abductor. But police were pretty adamant that this was a stranger abduction and not a case of a runaway teen. Abby's abductor, Nate, showed her the press conference that her mom spoke at, where she begged Abby to come home, and as the hours turned into days and the days turned into weeks, there were still essentially no leads and no new evidence, not even so much as one single clue, lead, or tip as to where Abby was or who had taken her. And Abby's kidnapper, Nate, was getting pretty tired of seeing the searches and press conferences being blasted all over every news station and media platform around, so he comes up with this idea that he thinks will help put a stop to the searches and the tip hotlines. His idea? A letter. Nate tells Abby that she's going to have to write a letter to her mom, Zenya, and he tells her to make the letter sound convincing and make it sound like she just run away from home. Nate hoped that this would make the police, Abby's family, and the public stop worrying so much about Abby, and he kind of hoped that it would put a stop to them using more resources towards finding Abby. I think he actually wholeheartedly thought that they would just stop looking for her altogether if they thought that she ran away from home. That's not exactly how that works, Nate. And I've said it once, and I'll say it again. Abby is extremely smart, because she had her own idea when it came to this letter that she was going to be forced into writing. She used her fingernails to scratch the words help and kidnapped onto the paper before she used the pen to actually write anything. Her hope was that the police or even her mom would find her messages scratched into the paper and that they would know that she hadn't actually ran away, despite what the letter said. Sadly, though, this letter wouldn't be found until after a month of Abby being missing. It wouldn't be found until her face wasn't being plastered on every TV screen anymore, and the grid searches had come to a stop. There were still no leads and no tips coming in, and the ones that were coming in were becoming less and less. But Abby's mom, Zenya, was not about to let North Conway or the state of New Hampshire just forget about her daughter. And on November 6th, 2013, Zenya received a letter in the mail, but the letter had been postmarked from October 23rd. Zenya had just been so busy with the search for Abby and helping police and investigators, gather what they needed, that she hadn't checked her mail for a while before this. This was the letter that Abby had been forced to write, but it wasn't the letter that she had used her fingernails to scratch the words help and kidnap on. Sadly, Nate had found those hidden messages that Abby had tried to let her mom and police know that she was actually being held against her will and did not run away. When Nate found those attempts, he wasn't just going to let this disobedience go unpunished. He would use a taser and hold it to the bottom of Abby's feet as punishment. This is an extremely sensitive part of the body, and it's bound to be extremely painful, and this is something that would actually happen pretty frequently to Abby while she was in captivity. So this letter had been written 2 weeks after Abby had been kidnapped, and it had been sent exactly 2 weeks later, but it was actually another 2 weeks before her mom, Zenya, found the letter, just because she had been so laser focused on finding Abby that she hadn't even thought to check her mail, which is completely understandable. That seems like a pretty menial task at best when your daughter's missing. So by the time Zenya found this letter in her P.O. box, 4 weeks had actually passed since Abby had first been reported missing. And this letter said something along the lines of, "Dear Mom, I miss you. I love you more than you can imagine. I'm sorry I did this. I've seen the newspapers and TV reports. And to answer your questions, yes, I'm alive. I miss you, but I won't tell you where I am. Basically, please stop looking for me." And this was 2013. Everybody had cell phones, and Abby would have called or texted if this letter was the truth. But neither Zenya nor the investigators thought that Abby had written this letter of her own volition. They were convinced that Abby had been forced to write this letter as a way of kind of stopping the search efforts and to kind of make the case die down some. Zenya said that it was definitely Abby's handwriting, but that the verbiage and the use of certain words just didn't seem like the way that Abby would speak or say certain things. And everyone involved in this case was convinced that this wasn't something that Abby had chose to write. Now the dilemma was whether or not to release this letter to the public. Would it put Abby in more danger if her abductor was made aware that the police weren't buying this runaway letter? Another pretty good reason that police and investigators were so worried about releasing this letter to the public was the theory that maybe Abby had been able to sneak and write this letter and somehow send it to her mom without her abductor knowing about it. And that would put Abby in even greater danger than they believed that she was already in. Abby's DNA profile had been lifted off the letter and the envelope, and it was confirmed to be her. But after another few long months with no leads, the investigators finally decided to release the letter to the public. They also made sure to let people know that they were still classifying Abby as a missing persons and that they did not believe that she was a runaway. Even though the police tried to make it pretty clear that they didn't think Abby had ran away, the court of public opinion was in, and the public quickly turned on Zenya and her family. People were scrutinizing Abby for running away and wasting the state and the volunteers' time searching for her and any funds that they may have used along the way. And rumors were burning like wildfire at Kennett High School, where Abby and her best friend Miranda went to school. Miranda recalls that most of the people believed that Abby had run away because of an unexpected pregnancy. Even though Abby's family and friends knew that that wasn't the truth, not even close to the truth, that's what the talk of the town was. Zenya and the rest of Abby's close family and friends had already been ruled out as potential suspects, and Abby's boyfriend Jimmy was also ruled out as a viable suspect. There had been more than 5,000 tips that had poured in over the course of the 9 months that Abby was held captive, and not a single one of them led back to her real perpetrator. Nothing at all linked back to him, actually. One investigator said, quote, "We spent weeks, if not months, of looking at bank accounts and looking at people's locations, looking at alibis, to really come to the point of comfort that the individuals that were in her inner circle were not involved in this crime. We just didn't see anything that was suggestive to us that something she had done had caused her disappearance." Nate kept Abby bound and gagged and inside of this makeshift room inside the storage container, and to keep her from being able to be heard by anyone, he would just blast really hard metal music loud all day. Abby was also given a fish tank hose with an on-off switch wired up and attached to it, so that when she was thirsty or wanted something to drink, she would have to turn this switch on and let it drip into her mouth through the fish tank hose. And eventually, after a while of living like this, Nate told Abby that he had thought of a different and more humane way to leave her in this room all day by herself while he was at work. Because yes, he would leave her in this room, tied up all day while he was at his job. And this more humane way to keep her quiet, and in order to turn off the constantly blaring metal music, he would attach a large shock collar to her neck and lock the back of it where she wasn't able to get it off. This was the same kind of shock collar that you would use for bark training very large breed dogs, maybe a pit bull, German shepherd, or golden retriever. And in order to test this collar and show Abby how it would work, he told Abby to speak at a higher volume than she normally would. And as she started speaking and she got louder, she was immediately shocked by the collar. And after Abby spoke and was then shocked, Nate told her that now she knows how it feels and that he would advise against her screaming or yelling to keep from being shocked, because that's really humane. And the entire time that Abby had been being held against her will there, her captor Nate had been wearing a mask, almost like a Halloween mask, and Nate told Abby that this way she would forget what his face looked like, even though she had already seen his face when he offered her a ride home on the day that he kidnapped her. At one point, though, Nate became more paranoid than usual and told Abby that he was going to have to move her to a different location. He put Abby in the car and drove her around for what seemed like hours. Was he taking her even further away from her hometown of North Conway? And I'm here to say it again, Abby was so freaking smart. In order to keep track of the time that they had been driving, Abby was singing American Pie in her head over and over. She knew that this song was approximately 8 minutes long, so once she finished singing it, she knew that about 8 minutes had passed. And Abby would end up singing this same American Pie song over and over and over again in her head. She was blindfolded and had no way of knowing what direction they had been driving in or where he was taking her now. And when the car eventually stopped, Abby was walked into another small room with nothing more than a mattress inside. What Abby didn't know was that the same shipping container that she had been in before had been modified by Nate, and it actually had 3 separate rooms in it. So Nate had literally driven her around for hours in circles just to try to confuse her. He had driven her in circles and then right back to his house and put her back in the same shipping container that she had been in before, just in a different room. But Abby had no way of knowing this. She believed that she was even further away from home now and possibly even in a completely different state. Abby noticed that there were wires and screws leading from the inside of the door to the outside. When she asked Nate about it, he told her that the door was booby-trapped to keep anyone out that may come in to rescue her. That if the door was busted down for any reason, that the room would just engulf itself in flames with her inside of it. This wasn't true either, but Abby didn't know that either. How could she know that? Abby was then told that she would call him master, which is just plain creepy. Let's not act like it's not creepy. So I think we can all agree on how smart Abby actually is. She has so far figured out a way to keep track of time in some sort of manner. She's also taken in what few of her surroundings she could see to remember to tell police later. But now was her time to do probably the smartest thing that she could have possibly done, given her situation. She pretended to understand her captor, Nate. She tried to befriend him, and she even made him think that she liked being there with him, which had to almost kill her to pretend that she was okay with being held captive. And with Abby's new tactic of befriending Nate, that came with some slip-ups on Nate's part. He had been making sure up until this point to keep his face completely covered from Abby, until one night when Nate fell asleep with Abby, and when she woke up before him, she saw that his face mask was off and that she could see his face for the first time since he had taken her. Abby spent about 9 months total with Nate against her will, but during the time that she attempted to bond with him, she had actually gotten strangely comfortable with Nate, and he had gotten just as comfortable with her. And during this time that the two were experiencing some kind of strange bond with one another that none of us could probably ever possibly understand, Nate told Abby about the time that he had spent in a juvenile detention center at the state prison where he was placed in psychiatric care for 42 days because he was deemed to be a threat to himself. Nate told Abby that the people that ran this facility had abused him and all the kids that were being held there. Nate also let Abby in on the fact that he sold marijuana, and he had even talked to her about a plan to start making counterfeit money. Nate told Abby that he wanted to start making counterfeit money on his own just to see if he could pass it off as real money. The bond between these two had actually gotten so oddly strong that Nate trusted Abby to help him with all of his illegal activities. He let her participate in most ways, and Abby agreed to help Nate make this counterfeit money. She later says that the way that she was able to gain his trust was to just kind of go along with anything that Nate said that he wanted to do. She just never argued with him, so she fed into stroking his ego in more ways than one, which is quite possibly one of the only reasons that she was able to survive this. And even though Abby had tried to go along with anything that Nate said, when he wasn't happy with her response or he felt that she had disobeyed him in some way, she was still being tased on the bottoms of her feet every time that she said or did something that he didn't like. She was also still forced to wear this shock collar around her neck, and it would still shock her every time she spoke above a slight whisper. There was also still a lock on the back of the shock collar so that it wasn't able to be taken off. Abby's mom, Zenya, along with the Conway Sheriff's Department and the DA, hadn't given up on finding Abby, but they also told Zenya that they couldn't keep putting resources into Abby's case when there were newer, fresher cases that needed the attention too. Nate would eventually get comfortable enough with Abby that he finally did tell her his real name and a lot about his background. Abby did end up helping Nate make counterfeit money because she kept trying to create a stronger bond with him to try to make him trust her even more than he already did. Police had no way of knowing that Nate was the one that had taken Abby. He was actually never even on their radar as a suspect in Abby's case. Even though during the 9 months that he held her captive, the police had actually been to his house for a brief time. Nate had gotten into a little bit of a fender bender car accident, and he got kind of violent and aggressive with the woman that he had hit. So as a precaution, he was ordered to turn over all of his guns, and Nate had guns for days. This was just a way for them to get through the court proceedings if the woman that he had hit decided to press charges against his aggressive and violent tendencies that happened during the accident. He would eventually be able to get these guns back. The Gorham, New Hampshire police in the town that Nate was holding Abby in, they knew of Nate, but they hadn't connected him to Abby's disappearance like I mentioned, and Nate was going to make sure that they didn't put two and two together. The police were fully expecting Nate to come out with his Second Amendment rights and stating the Constitution as fact as a reason for him to keep his guns, but when they got to Nate's mobile home, they were kind of shocked to see that Nate had already gotten all of his guns outside, and he was just kind of waiting outside with his guns when the police arrived. Which is also just another Ariel Castro moment for me. The police show up at the front door and there are people being held against their will inside, just steps away from the same police that have been searching for these people. They never end up going in. I don't understand it. The assault charges that Nate had gotten when he had hit the woman in his car had eventually been dropped, and he was given all of his guns and ammo back. After this, the months kept passing with investigators not getting any closer to finding any leads, tips, or clues as to Abby's whereabouts. That was until Nate made one mistake that he just would not be able to fix. And that mistake would come in the form of a woman named Lauren Monday. Lauren Monday would end up being Abby's saving grace, and neither Lauren or Abby saw this coming. Nate had met Lauren online, and the two eventually met in person at a hotel for the night, which Nate offered to pay for. And the two spent a few hours together in the room. When Nate left, he also left Lauren three $50 bills on the table beside the bed. And I'm not sure if Lauren was a sex worker or if Nate just had so much counterfeit money laying around that he was just giving it out to anybody he came in contact with. Either way, after Nate left, Lauren headed to the local Walmart nearby and was going to buy a few things. Lauren gathered her few things, and when she got to the register to check out, the Walmart cashier alerted Walmart management to the fact that the $50 bill was fake. Lauren had some explaining to do, and she was not in on this little counterfeit scheme. She had no idea. She wasn't going to hold back either. She told police that she had met up with Nate, that he had rubbed her head, he had played with her hair until she fell asleep, and that when she got up, the room had been paid for, and that there were three $50 bills on the nightstand beside the bed. What Lauren didn't know was that the name that Nate had given her was not his real name. Nate told Lauren that his name was Jay, and he even told her that he had done some pretty bad things in his life, but then he goes on to say that, everyone's done bad things in their life. Lauren was pissed, and rightfully so. She called Nate to tell him that whatever he had going on, he better get it cleaned up and gone, because the police were on their way there, and they were going to arrest him for making counterfeit money. Lauren didn't know that Jay wasn't Nate's real name, and she definitely didn't know that Nate was holding Abby hostage in a storage container right outside of his mobile home. So now the police have a description and a name for the man that had given Lauren the counterfeit money. That's not really any good without the real name to be able to run to find a current address. Now, luckily for Abby, this phone call from Lauren had freaked Nate out so bad that he came into the room of the storage container and told her that he had to get rid of her. And I'm sure Abby was thinking the absolute worst at this point, because normally when somebody who is this off their rocker says that they need to get rid of you, it normally means it's time for them to kill you and make you go away for good. But instead, Nate gave Abby back the clothes that she had been wearing on the day that he had kidnapped her. And then Nate went over the story that Abby was supposed to tell her family and the police about where she had been for the last 9 months. And weirdly enough, this story does not involve Nate at all. Which, shocker, right? None of us saw that coming. And after Nate and Abby went over this story that he had made up for the 50th time, he made sure to tell Abby that he would kill her entire family and even her family pets, as well as any police that showed up at his door asking about Abby and her disappearance. After all of this was explained, Nate would put Abby back into his car. Abby and Nate drove for a while until Nate pulled into a Dairy Queen parking lot, and Dairy Queen is a small fast food chain known for their ice cream, hot dogs, and burgers. Nate hands his baseball hat to Abby and tells her to put it on so that no one will recognize her face from all the media coverage. The two ordered food from Dairy Queen and ate together. They got back into Nate's car and drove a little further, and when they came to a secluded back road, Nate stopped the car in the middle of the road, and when he stops the car, he tells Abby to get out. She doesn't need to be told twice, because when Nate unlocks the doors, she gets out immediately. She turns to walk away from her kidnapper when Nate tells her that he needs his hat back because I guess it's either a really nice hat or because he's worried about his DNA being all over it. Abby throws the hat into the front seat of Nate's car and slams the door. She turns to walk away as Nate drives off. Nate had dropped Abby off on a deserted road about a mile away from her house, after he kept her against her will for the last 9 months. Nate kept driving and Abby just kept walking. She said that she even kind of laughed to herself like, oh my God, I'm free. Back at the Hernandez house, the security camera actually caught footage of Abby walking up on the front steps of her house. Abby later says that when she got closer to the door, she could hear her mom talking on the phone. And when Abby walked inside, she and Zenya both just cried and held each other for what seemed like an eternity. And naturally, the police or Abby's mom, Zenya, were not just going to accept the fact that Abby had come home with some warped story about where she had been for 9 months. She was 14 years old when she vanished, and they needed answers. But it would be answers that Abby really wasn't willing to give to them. She was too worried about her family and their safety if she told them the truth about where she had been. Naturally, this would be an extremely touchy subject for Abby. She was scared for her family's life, her own life, and even the lives of the same police officers and investigators that had spent so many man-hours searching for her. Nate had made it very clear to her that he would kill them if she spoke so much as one word about him. And sadly, Nate's plan worked for a while. It was an entire week later when Abby finally felt safe enough to tell her mom Zenya her captor's name. Abby just kept telling her mom that she knew his name, but that she couldn't tell anybody. And that was after Zenya had to assure Abby that she was safe and that the police would get him. This was after Zenya assured Abby that she was safe, that she didn't have to be afraid of him anymore, and after she comforted her daughter and made it a point to let Abby know that Nate could not hurt her anymore, Abby finally broke down and told her mom that his name was Nathaniel Kibby, and that she knew that he lived in Gorham, New Hampshire. It took Zenya days and days of assuring Abby before they finally got her captor's name. But when they did, Zenya alerted authorities to let them know that Abby had given her the name of the man that had taken her. And the police didn't waste any time. They headed straight to Gorham to question Nate, with a SWAT team in tow right behind them. Because backup. Police were convinced that Nate would be there waiting for them with all of his miniguns ready for a gunfight. But that's not what happened. Nate spoke with police peacefully, he didn't resist arrest, and when they got there and started looking around, they found hundreds and hundreds of pieces of evidence that all backed up what Abby had been saying. Because once Abby felt comfortable enough to give him his name, she spilled it all. She let them know every gory detail of what he had done to her. While police were there collecting evidence, they found the mask that Nate had been wearing for the first few months or weeks that he had Abby in captivity. They also found the shipping container with 3 separate rooms inside. They also found the shock collar and so much more. There was absolutely no way around it that they had the right man. This was the man that had taken, tortured, raped, and held Abby hostage for those long 9 months. And it seemed like Nate wasn't such a tough guy in a situation where he was faced with a stronger person than himself. He was the type of man that was only strong when he's threatening or hurting somebody much smaller, meeker, and weaker than him. So we here at Mama Murdered a Podcast like to call men like this boys, not men. And I feel like Conway Police Chief Chris Purley said it best when he said, quote, "Nate Kibby behaved like Nate Kibby always behaved. He was never physically confrontational with the police. He was violent in situations where he had the upper hand and the victim was compromised." And I feel like there's no other way to sum that up better than he did. 34-year-old Nate Kibby would finally be held accountable for his actions on July 29, 2014, when he was charged with the kidnapping and sexual assault of Abby Hernández. And I know we try to keep it PG on this podcast, but I feel like you have to use words where they're necessary. And Abby wasn't going to keep being afraid of Nate because she was going to face him in the courtroom like the badass that she is. And like the coward man-boy that he is, Nate would again take the easy way out with a plea deal. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 45 to 90 years in prison. There were initially 183 charges filed against Nate, but after the plea deal that he took, he would only be convicted of 7 of those 183 charges. Deputy Attorney General Jane Young is still bothered by the fact that even though there were mounds and mounds of evidence against Nate, and all of it corroborated Abby's recollection of what happened during her time in captivity, there are still people in the public that don't believe the things that Abby said happened to her. Some people even think that she went with Nate voluntarily. Some thought that she wasn't even acting emotional enough to be a kidnapping survivor. And other people say that they just simply don't buy it. When New Hampshire's Deputy Attorney General Jane Young is asked if there's any reason for people not to believe what Abby says happened to her, she's quoted saying, quote, "What this investigation revealed is that every painstaking detail the victim has provided was in fact true, no doubt. Everything supported by evidence, hundreds of pieces of evidence, physical evidence, purchase records, statements of other individuals." ABC News consultant Brad Garrett is quoted saying, quote, "If I were going to write a textbook about how victims should deal with abductions, the first chapter would be about Abby." He goes on to say, quote, "It's always about bonding with the bad guy." After Nate's sentencing, Abby returned to life with her family by her side, She went on to achieve her dream of becoming a hairdresser, and she later fell in love with a man, got pregnant, and the two had a beautiful baby boy together. And if my math is correct, Abby's son would be about 3 or 4 years old now. There was a Lifetime movie that was made about Abby's case, and to my surprise, it's actually extremely accurate to the actual events. But my guess for why it's so accurate would be because Abby herself was one of the producers of the movie. Most Lifetime movies add or remove things to make for better TV, but this one is almost spot on for what actually happened. When Abby was asked about how she felt about the movie, she said, quote, "I don't feel scared anymore. Obviously, it's a weird experience to have this happen in the first place, and then to have it be made into a movie is obviously like an even weirder experience. But ultimately, I did find it healing in a weird way, just to have it out there." Abby and her immediate family have stayed under the radar as far as social media goes. Abby's also believed to still be living in North Conway, New Hampshire, and taking pride in making people feel their best with an amazing hair day, and taking pride in raising her son and living her best life. And this is the case of Abby Hernández. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.